Hello, everybody. It's Miss Carter here, and I'm just going to be presenting to you our lessons for this week. And the first one that we are going to be presenting, well, actually, all of them deal with the Unit 2, which is reproduction. And basically, the first thing we're going to be looking at is Lesson 1. The first section is on pages 10 to 15 in your book. So, lesson one is going to deal with inheritance. So, let's go ahead and just kind of dive in there. If this loads. All right. So, inheritance basically is going to be dealing with our characteristics, our traits, is what we call them in science. How do we look, or why do we look the way we do? Why do we sometimes act the way we do? Why are there certain diseases, certain disorders that we have, and our parents also had, or our grandparents had, or our great grandparents had? All of that can be traced through something called inheritance. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So, your traits, as I said, are characteristics, things that are true about you. And examples of that are hair color or your height. Height typically tends to be related to somebody in your family tree. It might be mom and dad, could be grandparents, could be aunts and uncles, same way that hair color is. I know I was asked the question just recently, how do you have a family member with red hair when mom and dad don't have red hair, grandparents didn't have red hair? Well, somewhere along that line, chances are there was somebody with the red hair, and it just so happened to come out in that individual. And so we're going to look at that and how that's possible today. The way that we look at those traits or characteristics in science, it's called the phenotype. Okay, pheno-ph. And phenotype is how the trait appears or is expressed. The way that I remember that is pheno is physical. So both of those start with ph. It is a physical trait. Okay, something that you can see or experience. Okay, direct hand or directly. For example, brown hair. So that is phenotype. It's the physical characteristic, something that you can see. Brown hair, blue eyes, 5'3". All of those are physical things that we can see. Heredity, which is the study of genetics, is the traits that are passed down from parents to offspring. So heredity or your genetics is what we're going to be looking at in this entire unit, really. The things that we can actually see above us in our parents, grandparents, and so on. So, genetics is the study of that heredity. It's the study of how traits are passed from parents to offspring. Okay, that's just the technical definition of it. This study of genetics is actually pretty new. It hasn't been around for a really long time, at least not in the grand scheme of science. And so it is one of those things that we are still learning a lot about. There's still a lot of studies in, still a pretty interesting area in science. So if you are deciding to choose an area in science, that is one that I definitely recommend because there's a lot new information and a lot yet to be discovered. The first person to really come up with the idea of genetics was a guy named Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk, and basically what he did is he lived out kind of in the middle of nowhere. And if you know what a monk is, he basically was a religious man that would monks were a lot of times just kind of sent to live and be in deep thought and prayer, and sometimes also to help others. But they were a lot of times in very secluded areas. Okay. So this is, back at a time before, internet, before TV, before anything where you really had a lot to occupy yourself. And plus the fact that he was, like I said, in an area that was very secluded, very separated. And he liked to, uh, as his hobby, his way to kind of keep his time, is he liked to grow things, grow plants, to farm basically. And he also found that by doing that he could also provide some food and help the people around him out as well. And one particular thing that he grew were pea plants. Okay, like the little green peas that you eat out of a can. Um, and what he did is he found that if when he was breeding those pea plants, or in other words, growing more from the seeds that he already had, from the plants he already had, there was kind of an interesting thing that was happening. Um, what he was finding was that his particular plants, there were certain areas in his, not field really, but in his section of his garden that uh, seemed to be expressing a certain dominant trait, or a certain characteristic that appeared all the time, and that dominant trait was the tallness of the pea plant. In other words, how tall it was compared to the shorter ones. And in certain areas, all you were finding was tall, and then in other areas, all you were finding was the short. And so he was kind of, perplexed by this. Again, they didn't have a whole lot else going on. And so he started to wonder, what's the reasoning for this? Why, do I have so many tall plants over here, so many short plants over here? They're growing from the same type of seed. Why is this happening? And so he started to do some experimenting with it. It's called controlled breeding. And basically, it's where he would take the plants and take some tall ones that, had been given nothing but tall. Like, the original plants were tall, the next generation was tall, the next one was tall. So all of it's tall plants. And he would take the ones with the small, and he would take those that were always small and kind of bring them into a secluded area, kind of like a greenhouse, so that nothing could influence what was breeding with what. So that, kind of remember back the things that actually cause plants to have to be bred are things like the wind carrying the seeds, animals like bees, and birds carrying pollen. Um, Humans can do it. Other animals, it can be rubbing against their fur and then rub back on it. So those type of things he wanted to control. Okay, those are the variables he wanted to kind of get rid of. And so he took and he moved them inside. And he started to examine, first off, the dominant traits, that tallness factor. And he said, what about if I kind of look at this as the tall one is being our dominant thing, the thing that's going to just keep showing up again and again and again. And then I look at the shortness as something that's, it's not as common. I don't see it as often. So I'm going to call that a recessive trait. Okay. And a recessive trait is basically one that is going to be blocked if if the dominant trait is there. Okay, so the recessive trait is only going to show up when there's nothing else there. You kind of envision it like, like a bullying situation, that the dominant trait, if the dominant trait's there, the recessive trait, he ain't gonna get any food, he's not gonna get noticed, it's gonna be just kind of hidden behind. But when the dominant trait is gone, wherever, if just the recessive trait is there, then you may listen to the recessive trait. You may see the recessive trait. The recessive trait gets its say. And so that's kind of what he noticed here, is that most of the time all he saw were the tall plants. But every once in a while, all he was able to see that the recessive trait, that shortness in this case. And so, dominant traits can be that tallness and shortness in plants. It can be in humans, the dark hair is more dominant compared to blonde or red hair. And so that's why typically you tend to see more dark-headed people than blonde or redhead. Um, unless in that family, there's a lot of those traits. If the mom is redhead, or and the dad is redhead, or if the mom is blonde and the dad is blonde, or grandparents or whatever, you're going to see more blonde. Now there may be all of a sudden one dark-headed kid that shows up. Well, that's because all of a sudden that dark-headed bully, that dominant one, came back in, and so it hides that blonde. Okay. So anyway, the dominant trait is what you're going to see. If it's there, that's it. You're not going to see anything else. And so Mendel started playing around with this stuff, and he started experimenting more and more. And as time went on, he published some papers on it and everything. And there were some other factors that started to kind of come out, not just from Mendel's observations, but other people throughout the scientific community as well. And one of those things is the chromosome. Um, the chromosome basically is something that we see inside of our DNA. It contains genetic information and it controls the traits. Humans have 46 chromosomes, okay? And what that means is that inside of our DNA, we have 46 of those DNA ladders that we've looked at before. And those chromosomes control everything about us. So again, like we said, those chromosomes are our eye color, our hair color, how tall we're going to be, all of it, and including the enzymes that help us to be able to digest things like, milk. Okay, and we talked about the lactose intolerance, things like that. All of that is in your chromosomes. Now, a certain portion of the chromosome, a certain section of it, is known as the gene. Now, the gene is going to be even smaller, a more specific part of the genetic information. And something that we call those genes that, are going to identify a specific trait are the alleles. Okay. The alleles are different forms of a gene, or the different specific trait that we're looking at. Okay. And so with Mendel, as well as with others later on, they looked at those alleles and they said, okay, how can we use this information to try and determine what is going to happen in the next generation? Okay. And so they identified something. If you remember the phenotype that we had earlier, phenotype meaning the physical trait, I didn't need any kind of microscope or anything like that to be able to determine that somebody had a blonde hair, or somebody has blue eyes, or somebody is 5'3". With the genotype, you need to be able to go a little bit deeper. You need to actually be able to look in their chromosomes. You need to be able to look in their genes. And so the genotype is their genetic information, okay? So genetic, pheno, physical, okay? And so the genotype is what we're really going to be focusing on in this unit, as well as with this next part here, which are called the Punnett squares and things of that nature. Okay, so first off, when we were looking at those genotypes, those alleles, we look at one specific trait at a time. Okay, so in this example right here, we've got color of the flower. Okay, and this could be like this particular one here is focusing on those the pea plants that Mendel was working with, and he had purple colored ones and he had white colored ones. Okay, now we talked earlier about he focused on things like the height. Well, height is separate. This is a different trait. Okay, this is the color of the flower, and so what he noticed is that the purple flower seemed to be more dominant. Okay, it was the one that seemed to be more common. We would see it all the time, and genetically later on was able to prove this with microscopes and so on. But basically, what he found here was that the dominant genes here, or the dominant alleles, he called them big B, big B. Okay, and so these two alleles right here put together mean that you have what's called a dominant homozygous pea plant. Okay, and so basically that means that purple is your dominant color. So anytime you had that big B show up, purple is what we're going to see. Okay, this plant is what's known as heterozygous. All right, heterozygous basically means that I've got one of the big bees and one of the little bees. But because of the fact that big B is there, that bully is still there, that big letter, then that's what you're going to see. Okay? The big B is always going to be visible and always going to be hiding out the little one. That's why you're going to see these together. You don't see the little B first. The big B is dominant, it takes over. Okay? So the big B shadows the little b. You can't see it. All right? Now that white color, it's hidden in there. All right? Its grandkids or its great grandkids can be white, but it's purple because of that big B. Okay? So since it's got both, it's called heterozygous. Now, later on down the road, that great grandkid or whatever, all of a sudden has two little b's. Okay? Well, that basically what that means is that this grandparent and another grandparent that also was this way came together to make this, which is called a homozygous recessive pea plant. And that means that it is white because recessive is white is the recessive allele. Okay? So recessive means hidden unless there's no big one there, and homozygous means two of the same. Okay? So homozygous, two of the same. So you got homozygous recessive because they're two little ones, homozygous dominant, two big ones. And then when you put one of each together, it's heterozygous. Okay? So when we're looking at this, just kind of going over this one more time, the alleles are going to be represented by these symbols, okay, these letters. And what letters you use is really, I mean, it's up to you. It doesn't have to be B's here. It could be, I could use capital P's for purple. It's entirely up to you, okay? But the uppercase one is always dominant. The lowercase is always recessive, okay? You'll always put the capital one first. Lowercase always goes second. It always hides it. And again, homozygous means that two alleles of a gene are always the same. So you can have homozygous both capital, you can have homozygous both little. Okay, and like I said here, they use the R's. Doesn't matter what letter we're using. Okay, it just means both of them capital, both of them little. It's homozygous. If they're both capital R's, then they're homozygous dominant. Both little R's, homozygous recessive. And then the opposite of that, the heterozygous, is when you've got two different. Okay, so one capital, one lowercase. That would be heterozygous. Okay, and you're still going to see only the capital, but that little one's there, and that could affect the next generation. Okay. All right, so that is our notes for this particular lesson. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to call it, it is not the end of our inheritance lesson. But that does kind of get us to the point where we're ready now to mathematically decide, how do we determine what traits you're going to have? How can you make an educated guess as to, is a plant going to be tall? Is it going to be short? Is a plant going to be purple? Is it going to be white? Okay. Am I going to have blonde hair, brown hair? All of those things can mathematically be guessed, educatedly guessed. And that's going to be called the Punnett square, which we will learn in the next lesson. Okay. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you in our next lesson. Thanks, guys. Bye.